One thing I think that's been interesting about this particular subject of understanding agency, consciousness, intelligence in general, this intersection of physics, neuroscience, AI, all these different fields, cosmology that are here, is the degree to which we are very introspective about what we do, where there's a certain self-consciousness about the subject, even questioning our own interest in it at times. I've heard people question whether progress can be made on some of these questions. So there's been a lot of meta comment, I think, here. And I think Alyssa really brought this out in questioning or asking, talking about physicalism and whether we can ever escape the fact that our physical theories will never be complete. And I like the way she formulated that. But in a sense, it also came out in these talks that the incompleteness of physics is part of what it is. The fact that we can set aside the ultimate completion of the subject and nonetheless make an incremental process is really essential to the field, and it's been true historically. And I always like when a lot of these debates hinge on definitions. It's all too easy to get caught up in that or appeal to, oh, it's just a definition that is the difference between us. But I think a lot of speakers have made the point that we don't have to be slaves to our definitions. The definitions are in service to us. So one thing, actually riffing off the point of definitions, I don't think at any point in this meeting did we ever properly define what the meeting is even about. Anthony, you did that a little bit at the very beginning. It's come out especially in Carlo's talk, Larissa's talk. But let me just point out the thermostat in my room as an example. We can obviously talk about the thermostat itself as an agent. That's always kind of a paradigm case in philosophy. But I want to talk about my own experience with the thermostat in my room. I don't know how many people had the same experience of a freezing room and a somewhat opaque thermostat dial. Why is the mark at 20? Is that supposed to be the default setting? Which way do you turn this dial to make it colder or warmer in the room? I was a little perplexed, probably largely because of jet lag when I encountered my thermostat. So what did I do? I interacted with it. I turned it both ways and saw what happened to the state of the thermostat. Did it click on or off? So I made sense of the thermostat by acting on the thermostat. And that seems to have been a lesson of a lot of our discussions of agency today, that our observations of the world depend on our interacting with the world. It's a loop that we have and that we try to close. Also, and I don't know if Carl Friston is still here, this is very much in keeping with his ideas. Why did I turn this thermostat? What was my motivation for this? It was to maintain my own bodily homeostasis, that I wasn't going to freeze to death in my room or boil. Okay. So there's the need for agency is also implicit in that kind of operation. So I think that's come out in a few of the talks is why are we able to interact in a deliberate, goal-directed way in the world, which is the essence of the word agency. And actually Olaf is here, so you could correct me if I got your idea wrong. So I'm going to take this talk and the kind of summary I'm going to try to effect in three stages, going in both directions on the subject and then coming at it from a third direction. So one is, what can physics say about agency? And physics, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle between the FQXi broad definition of physics that's been mentioned and the narrower definition that we might have in terms of academic departments. And I'm not going to try to be comprehensive here, that would be impossible, but I think a few recurring themes occurred I'd like to bring out. So certainly one thing, this came up in the very first talk, in the very first session, is that, and this is perhaps one of the most definite ways that physics can speak to the question of agency, is understanding causation, the causal asymmetry, certainly the macroscopic world, and the arrow of time. So we are agents, we're able to be agents because of this asymmetry. So it's a precondition for our own existence or category of agent. So we need to have an effect in the world to be a legitimate agent. We have to be able to cause things. And we see that in the world. The world is indeed causally asymmetric. There is a notion of cause in the folk sense of that term. And there were several talks, a number of talks really, that dealt with that very question. Sean and Carlo and Ian really tried to piece together arguments about the arrow of time and about the multi-scale physics emergence and kind of a Judeo-Pearl idea of causation into an account of this. Then there was a comment that it wasn't a main topic of discourse, but it did come out in a few different talks, Andy Albrecht, Carlo, about how to partition the system in a way that actually gives rise to an asymmetry in it, even if the system itself is stationary or symmetric. And both Jane and Mile talked about the relation between classical and quantum. An epsilon machine, for example, can be symmetrical, but a classical one can be asymmetrical. So I was taken by that as well. And a few people, mostly in discussion or in Q&A, asked whether we actually need new physics to explain causation or indeed just the causal asymmetry of the world. So Jim talked about this, Bernard, Adrian, and Pavo. So definitely one major theme to me of the conference that I'm taking away, and hopefully we'll be writing about at some point, again, is causation. What is it? It seems to be tied up with our very being as intelligent, as conscious, and as capable of acting in the world. Okay. This is actually kind of riffs off the previous slide a little bit, that to be an agent is to be ignorant. There's actually kind of an interesting relation here between having perfect knowledge of the world and being able to act in it. I thought that was actually kind of interesting. This is just a question I will pose. Is a Laplace demon an agent? They seem to be just kind of going along for the ride. They're kind of a learned helplessness. If you were indeed a godlike predictor in nature. But I think that kind of idea was implicit in these other ideas. Again, going back to Mile and Jane, that the classical epsilon machine has extraneous variables, has redundancy in it, and that seems to be connected with the asymmetry of those machines, or is the asymmetry of those machines. Suzanne gave, I think, a really cool talk on, a number of things, but certainly that evolution would drive living beings to be efficient and therefore to eliminate some of that redundancy. Dominic talked quite a bit about what is knowledge and how do we reduce uncertainty in our description of the world. So again, there was kind of a selective ignorance that seems to be implicit in this concept of agent. One thing I should point out, just as a footnote here, is there's been a kind of a mission creep in this word agent throughout the meeting. It's not just a question of acting in a directed, goal-directed way, but of being conscious, of being intelligent, and so forth. So there are many meanings of probably that weren't already in the word agent that we've kind of layered onto it as we've gone on. And David gave, actually, I think his lightning talk, an interesting discussion about the need for hidden states in computational operations. So again, there's an ignorance going on here. Some of my favorite discussions were on the question of our enduring existence as observers, agents, conscious beings in the world, and how things get really weird. Even if they're all Schrodinger evolution ultimately, they definitely get weird if we can't be assured, if we can't trust in the fact that I will be the same person in a minute or in a microsecond or an infinitesimal moment from now. And this also came out in a number of the talks, this question of the importance of trans-temporal identity or stability of identity. Certainly, Wigner's friend, Frau Renner, and that whole complex of variant thought experiments, and actually real experiments in some cases, seem to hinge, at least some people would argue, on not being Hadamarded all the time and then losing one's own past. Jan talked about this in an evolutionary context, that our ability to remember the past is literally what gives us an ability to operate in the world. And then yesterday we saw how if in the future our brains can be copied, uploaded, altered in some way, how that's really going to muck with our notion of personal identity. So going back to kind of undergraduate metaphysics kind of topics, and I won't even know how I can make predictions in that kind of context. There are a couple other senses in which temporal stability is important to our ability to act in the world that came out in the meeting, and it's kind of cool to think about. One is that once we do make a decision, we have to be sure that we can carry it out. That's actually an aspect of agency I haven't really seen other people really mentioned. Ian brought it up in his talk. Our ability to act is meaningless unless we can be sure that we can act. Our choice will actually have purchase. And Jeff, unfortunately, didn't get to it in his talk, but I managed to catch up with him afterwards about it. I don't claim to understand it, this notion of becoming time that he's talked about. But he sees a role for an entanglement in a sense of passage of time that might be present at a fundamental physical layer. Definitely the definition of organism, agent, conscious being, etc., depend on having good fences. Good fences make good agents. And I think this came out especially in talks by Larissa and by Carl. I was grateful for Larissa's talk because she actually took a stab at, she was, I think, the first talk in the meeting to take a stab at what is an agent, how do we define an agent? And she talked about it in the context of IIT, but perhaps as a more general idea. And then Carl returned to that question later with this idea of Markov blankets. Why is the fence important, though? What is it doing? Despite, I mean, there's a trivial sense of which that tells you what the thing is yet to be a thing is to be a localized subsystem. But in addition to that, there's a robustness that comes about from that the system, if properly defined, is resistant to being altered. Actually, in other words, it can maintain its integrity. And then Carl's point is that a system that has this property actually necessarily has it mirrors the external world to some extent. So that's how the stability criterion for an agent actually requires the agent to know something about the outside world and to represent it in some way. And then you can riff on that idea in a number of ways, as several speakers, Carl, David, and Joska certainly did, that our very conscious experience is that mirroring. And it's actually coming from within. It's ultimately coming from without, perhaps, but then we're being filtered through the inside. It's a hallucination. We're all hallucinating and dreaming all the time. And David had a point that I think bears on this as well, which is, and this was the idea that a system that's thermodynamically reversible will only be thermodynamically reversible for certain states. Another way I think of putting that, David, please, where you are, correct me if I get this wrong. If you take a paramecium, I think is the example he told me just privately, and put it in a different environment, it won't be as efficient. And our living organisms are highly efficient, obviously, but that depends on the environment that they're in. So you take the paramecium to some other environment, it won't achieve it won't be as efficient thermodynamically, and presumably have to evolve as well. So part of the physical division between the physical division formed by the boundary of an agent is also the perspectival one, and this is kind of, this is basically a first-person perspective, but not necessarily literally a subjective experience, but certainly a system has to have to be considered an agent or a conscious observer, has to have a point of view of some sort. And Lydia really talked about this a bit in her first part of her remarks. And a lot of what physics does is to transform among these different points of view. And of course, Adam had such a fun talk on the counterfactual computation that you can actually discern the outcome of a computation without running it, which is amazing. Then there are a number of great discussions about, just at a practical level, how can physics help our understanding of the human, the machine system, or the extraterrestrial agent, and if indeed agents they are. So the idea of using quantum mechanics as a description, as a model for human reasoning, was mentioned a couple of times. It's something I've written about at the popular level, but it's really fun to think about. You don't have to literally think the brain is quantum in order to use quantum mechanics to describe it. Carl, and I think a comment that Carl made in response to Carl's talk, is that the idea of making models of the world in an incremental way, correcting them, acting in the world to improve the model, is not just something an agent, as an individual agent will do, but the entire scientific community does it. It's the process we go through historically. Jan actually also mentioned that in his opening remarks. Fun talk on sexual versus asexual reproduction and thinking about it in terms of a channel capacity. Again, using a physics idea to get into biology. I never thought about how we learn as children the categories of the world. We start with animal, plant, and then break those down hierarchically. Why do we have that hierarchical description of categories? And now we can study that through the medium of neural networks, as Surya talked about. And then a number of talks touched on questions of aliens and how we can look for them, that maybe around asymptotic giant branch stars, there'd be a good place to look for Dyson sphere type of scenarios, or using galactic scale interference experiments. It goes the other way too. This is a two-way dialogue, I think. It certainly is a major theme of FQX and of Fetzer as well, is using our study of agency, of consciousness, etc., to bear on the standard traditional questions of physics. So Sarah, Paul, George think that some new law of nature, they call it, or I would call principle of organization, is necessary to understand life, that our existing theoretical framework is inadequate to that task. But equally so, that the idea that life just goes places that non-life doesn't. That they didn't mention this, but I think it's true, the majority of the minerals on Earth are somehow rooted in the fact that Earth is a living system, or biological in origin ultimately. So maybe aliens would come to Earth and mine our minerals because they're not to be found anywhere else in the solar system. Larissa mentioned in, I think the panel, was it yesterday? That if nothing else, understanding consciousness will help us in physics because it will tell us, it will basically help us falsify theories. So whatever physics tells us, modulo any kind of observer dependence, has to be consistent with what we see. I mean, this has been a statement of empirical science, but one that's driven by phenomenology, our own phenomenology. And maybe quantum measurement can be considered the case of what she was saying. We don't experience superpositions. We see them in every experiment that we do, but we don't actually experience them directly. And that's what sends us down the path of considering strange options, or not strange, depending on your perspective. But certainly thinking about GRW comes out of that, or even putting, in a Wagnerian way, mind into our basic physics. And finally, in this direction, do we need actually to go further in putting the observer into physics? Can we reconstruct, in almost along the lines of Kant, the structure of the mind from the necessities of how we reason about the world? And this, Daniele talked about this a little bit as almost a research program, but Marcus really developed this a lot, and then Eleanor commented on it as well. We had a couple interesting and fun talks on whether physicists will one day they may be replaced, but in the interim, we can certainly use AI systems to help in scholarship. They can help us in the lab, as Andrew talked about, or they can do our algebra for us, as Max is doing, or find patterns that otherwise we would be blind to, as we might do with quantum computers. I think Max posed at one point whether an AI system could discover a whole new law of physics that we would be unable to discover on our own. So, in response to a discussion I had with Sean and Jennifer, I wrote this blog post on whether physics and physicists can make the world a better place. And Sean, you said they can't. And I was trying to argue against that. I'm very idealistic. Maybe it's because I'm kind of an outsider to the community about what people here can do. I think actually physics does make the world a better place, even if it's driven by its own internal concerns. Max, though, was arguing here that yes, indeed, maybe not physics per se, but those of us in this community with the expertise and energy and enthusiasm that we bring can help with, well, certainly AI kinds of issues. That arguably, it's an imperative that those of us who are concerned about these issues do. And if you're concerned about what AI might do in our society, either proximally or in the distant future, it's incumbent on you to do something about it. Arguably, the entire meeting is driven by moral concerns, because the reason we're interested in certainly conscious experience is that the moral salience that it has, that a world, a universe, as most indeed the universe is, that we can tell at least, is devoid of consciousness, kind of deprives it of moral significance. So we care about consciousness because we care about beauty, pain, etc. So the underlying the entire meeting has been, and it's come out at certain places explicitly, but certainly implicitly, it's because we care about the moral status of science. Speaking of which, we have to start with our own community. And so Zia shared with me some of and asked me indeed to talk about this now. There were several recommendations for how to improve gender balance, equality, or in FQX, if not in physics more broadly. I don't know if Zia, you wanted to talk about this a bit more, or I can go down the list myself, but I'm representing something I wasn't present at. But certainly, nomination process of FQX could attempt at achieving more gender balance. I think was a point that was made. And I've been involved in the essay contest, and maybe it would help that the essays, I don't know when the next essay contest round will be, but there's better attempt to ensure gender balance there. Either, but the community level is a tough one, because the FQX essay contest, if you're familiar with them, work by first a community ranking that then goes into a judging panel. The community ranking is basically a popularity vote, as far as I can tell, and probably a lot of interest that the public such it does has in the contest is because they like to pontificate and vote and so forth. So it'd be hard to blind it there, but maybe, undoubtedly, we judges were biased, and that needs to be corrected for. I think there's been a conspicuous and welcome effort at this meeting to be better with panel composition, but in the future, why not have an entire panel or session with non-male speakers? Then there's other issues that maybe those who are actually in that meeting can speak to. Maybe funding proposals should be advertised better, specifically to encourage people identify as female to apply. And education is always a point. We want everyone, certainly, but definitely girls to be excited about what we do.